Rules Committee come to order, and thank you very much for joining us this evening. Today, we will be considering H.R. 5192, the Protecting Children from Identity Theft Act, H.R. 5444, the Taxpayer First Act, and H.R. 5445, the 21st Century IRS Act. Synthetic identification fraud is a form of identity theft that begins when fraudsters combine a real Social Security number and a false information group, such as a name and date of birth, to apply to credit with a financial institution that passes that information to credit bureaus for a credit check, meaning that where you have someone that's not actively in the workforce, where their Social Security number is active, known, and understood, perhaps by a child, perhaps by a senior, perhaps by someone that might have what I might call a non-active Social Security working number. We have people who are taking these Social Security numbers and misusing them. Children and other individuals with weak or non-existent credit histories especially are vulnerable to having their Social Security number associated with a synthetic identity, since they do not work, drive, or establish credit, or an identity theft can misuse the child's Social Security number for a longer period of time before anyone really notices. As a father of a disabled child, a Down syndrome young man, I contacted credit bureaus and told them straight up, please be aware that my son's Social Security number should not be used for any purposes, and they put a check on it. This is what we need to talk about in this legislation, and we're delighted that you're here to do this. H.R. 5192 reduces synthetic identity fraud by allowing financial institutions to verify the accuracy of a name, a Social Security number, and date of birth before passing that information on to credit bureaus, making it assume as if the person really was asking for credit worthiness. Second bill under consideration, H.R. 5444, amends the IRS Code of 1986 to modernize and improve the Internal Revenue Service. Specifically, this bill would make the IRS modify its appeals, its summons, and other asset seizure procedures for the public. The third bill under consideration, H.R. 5445, would modernize the IRS information technology infrastructure and provide additional tools to protect taxpayer information that is used to combat and identify tax theft, including refunds that are fraudulent, bringing the IRS service online and allowing the agencies to accept credit payments would ease the tax filing burden on the American public and, in the end, save us from fraud. Without objection, I'd like to welcome the distinguished young gentleman, the young chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, the gentleman who I came in his class and who is our prize baseball player for the entire Congress, the gentleman Kevin Brady. Also the gentlewoman from Kansas, Congresswoman Jenkins, and certainly Ranking Member Lewis. John, we're delighted that you're here on this first panel. So anything you have in writing without the objection will be entered the record, but before we go there, we will move for any opening statement. Our new distinguished ranking member, the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm going to say something that I don't think I've ever said, and that is I applaud the process that brought these three bills before us. This is from all I can tell, a truly bipartisan process where Democrats and Republicans work together. These bills were thoroughly vetted, and so I applaud that. I wish all bills reflected this kind of process. I wish your tax bill did. I wish your attempts to overhaul our health care process did. I wish we could find this bipartisan cooperation to deal with gun violence and help the Dreamers, but I don't want to go down that road right now because I'll spoil this moment. But I do think it is important when the process is good to point it out. And so I have no complaints about the process, and I applaud all three of you for working together, and I look forward to moving these bills to the floor, and I yield back.
Mr. McGovern, thank you very much. Mr. Lewis, we're delighted that you're here. you recognize, and I do too, that Louise Slaughter served not only this Congress, but this distinguished Rules Committee, not only as the first woman who served as chairman, but her spirit has a lot to do with, I think, some spirit that we have up here of trying to work with each other. But I will tell you that I believe that your leader, Mrs. Pelosi, recognized that Mr. McGovern has not only put the time in, but is very capable. And it's my hope that over time you will see the wisdom behind his ability to see good and bad, work and non-work. And I promised Jim that I would come down and see him, and we're going to work together also, just as you attempt to do that, not only with your young chairman, Chairman Brady, but others. And so we're delighted that you're here to see this firsthand. Yes, sir.
That I'm honored to be here. I came to Congress with Mrs. Slaughter. I used to call her Sister Louise, and she called me Brother John. She was a wonderful and good friend. And I'm so sorry that we lost her, but her spirit is here. And I'm glad to see Mr. McGovern as the new ranking member. He's able, and he's a good friend also. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Mr. Lewis, you and I sat on the plane right across from each other, next to each other for several hours as we went up to Rochester, as we went up for a meaningful service, as we came back in full joy from that. And your words of wisdom about Louise, a lot of great honesty and a lot of good spirit went a long way. But I wanted you to know that this committee will continue to welcome you. And we're delighted that you're here. Mr. Chairman, thank you for taking time. I want you to know that a good number of members from Richardson, Texas, which is a part of the congressional district that I'm pleased to represent, are here, members of the Chamber of Commerce. We have our young mayor who is here. We have our deputy mayor. They are here to see firsthand. Part of it's to hold me accountable too. So if you can be nice to me today accidentally in front of a bunch of people who I've got to try and impress one way or another. Chairman's recognized.
That won't be hard to do, Chairman Sessions and new ranking member McGovern, members of the Rules Committee. Good afternoon. Thank you for allowing me to testify before you today on three important bipartisan pieces of legislation: the Taxpayer First Act, the 21st Century IRS Act, and the Protecting Children from Identity Theft Act. I'm joined by the leaders of the Oversight Subcommittee that developed over nearly 3 years these bills, the chairman, Lynn Jenkins of Kansas, and the ranking member, Mr. Lewis of Georgia. I'll start with the Taxpayer First Act, 21st Century IRS Act, which really together form the heart of our considered and bipartisan effort to reform the IRS. We've all heard the horror stories from our constituents about how it's impossible to get help or even someone on the phone from the IRS, how agents have an enforcement-first mentality instead of a service-first ethic, how the IRS is trapped in the past when it comes to technology and plain old customer service. It's been 20 years since Congress last considered major bills to overhaul the IRS. During that time, much has changed, and the IRS must change with it. The Taxpayer First Act was a bold bipartisan first step to redesign the agency, the IRS, into an agency with one singular mission: putting the taxpayers first. The bill does this by creating an independent appeals process, requiring the IRS to submit to Congress a comprehensive customer service strategy, and overhauling the agency's tools of enforcement to protect taxpayers. In addition, the Taxpayer First Act requires the IRS to submit to Congress, to us, a plan to redesign the structure of the agency to improve efficiency, enhance cybersecurity, and better meet the needs of taxpayers. This will guarantee the IRS is living up to its quality service mission and will hold the agency accountable if it fails to meet these standards. It's our goal to build a taxpayer-first IRS that works for taxpayers, not against them. Our second step is the 21st Century IRS Act. Currently, as you know, the IRS spends approximately $2.4 billion annually on IT. Yet it continues to struggle with undertaking and completing large modernization efforts to update its legacy systems, some of which date back to the 1960s. These issues result in the waste of millions of taxpayer dollars and time spent maintaining old, outdated systems. With the new 21st century tax code, it's time our tax administrator operates as a 21st century agency as well. By enhancing and modernizing the IRS's IT infrastructure, taxpayers' identities and personal financial information will be in safer hands. The 21st Century IRS Act accomplishes this by enhancing the IRS's ability to combat cybercrimes, including identity theft, through strengthening the agency's partnerships with states and cybersecurity experts. As Lynn Jenkins often says, no taxpayer should have to use a fax machine to communicate with the IRS. 21st Century IRS Act ensures that information can be submitted to the IRS electronically, including an electronic signature. Lastly, the Protecting Children from Identity Theft Act will better help protect our children from identity theft and combat a growing crime, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman. Synthetic identity fraud is a form of identity theft in which criminals combine a real Social Security number with fictitious information, such as a name and date of birth, to apply for credit with a financial institution that passes that information to credit bureaus for a credit check. Credit bureaus create a record based on the fraudulent credentials that, over time, establishes a synthetic identity based on the valid Social Security number but the wrong name. In 2016, credit card companies had approximately $1 billion in losses due to synthetic identity fraud. Children and other individuals with weak or non-existent credit histories are especially vulnerable to having their Social Security numbers associated with synthetic identity. Since they don't work, drive, or establish credit, an identity thief can misuse the child's Social Security number for a longer period of time before being noticed. This bill will prevent this kind of theft by requiring the Social Security Administration to match the name, the Social Security number, and the date of birth submitted by financial institutions against Social Security Administration records. Closing, I want to thank Subcommittee Chairman Jenkins, Ranking Member Lewis, for their work on this important transformation of the IRS, and Congressman Curbelo for his work on combating identity theft. This collection of targeted, bipartisan solutions will help address problems that many Americans struggle with. By passing these bills, we can take meaningful action to improve the lives of all taxpayers. With that, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, I conclude my statement.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Ms. Jenkins, you are the lead member on the Ways and Means Committee for the investigations, and we look forward to hearing from you. The gentlewoman's recognized.
Chairman Sessions, Ranking Member McGovern, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today in support of H.R. 5444, the Taxpayer First Act, which I introduced with Ranking Member John Lewis, and H.R. 5445, the 21st Century IRS Act, introduced by Congressman Mike Bishop and Congresswoman Susan Delbene. I'm proud to say that the members of the Oversight Subcommittee, Ranking Member Lewis and I, all approached the proposals included in these bills with a great deal of care and thoughtfulness. These bills are the product of over 13 bipartisan Oversight Subcommittee hearings and roundtable discussions over the past 3 years and are now being considered here before the Rules Committee just in time for tax day tomorrow. Personally, as a CPA, I'm proud to say the bills focus on the relationship between taxpayer and government by incorporating modern technology as well as a private sector-based customer service experience, focusing the agency on the taxpayer to ensure that their rights are protected, that they are treated with respect, and that the agency is approachable for taxpayers to ask questions and receive timely assistance. The Taxpayer First Act represents the first transformative revisions to the IRS since 1998 and addresses key issues like the formation of a truly independent IRS appeals process and requires the IRS to give Congress its comprehensive plan to improve its customer service strategy, which will be modeled on successful private sector best practices. I'm also pleased, among the many other provisions, that this bill renames the Commissioner of the IRS instead to the Administrator of the IRS to properly focus this role on administering our tax code. The next bill before us, the 21st Century IRS Act, will modernize the antiques that the IRS calls its IT system. In the era of 5G and broadband internet, it's so hard to imagine why the IRS continues to use technology our children wouldn't be able to recognize. On top of this, the bill includes a number of provisions to strengthen the agency's ability to proactively combat identity, tax fraud, and by codifying secure web-based data sharing recommendations by the Security Summit, a partnership formed in 2015 between the IRS, state agencies, and the private sector tax industry. Again, I want to thank Ranking Member Lewis for the bipartisan fashion in which this legislation was put together to reform our nation's tax administration agency. Thanks again to Chairman Sessions and Ranking Member McGovern for your co-sponsorship of the Taxpayer First Act. And finally, I want to thank the committee for your time and look forward to your questions.
Ms. Jennings, thank you very much. John, we're delighted that you're here. The gentleman's recognized.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the ranking member for inviting us to testify today. It has been a long time since I was in this room, so I'm delighted to be here. I'm proud to join my friends from the Ways and Means Committee to speak on H.R. 5192, the Protecting Children from Identity Theft Act. H.R. 5444, the Taxpayer First Act, and H.R. 5445, the 21st Century IRS Act. These bills are the product of truly bipartisan efforts. Let me begin with the Protecting Children Identity Theft Act. This is a good bill. It would direct the Social Security Administration to take important steps to prevent Social Security number theft and misuse. In a similar fashion, the Oversight Subcommittee came together because we wanted to improve the taxpayer's experience. The subcommittee hosted, as my colleague and dear friend stated, 6 public hearings and 5 round tables. We took our time, we studied, we listened, we asked many questions. The experience reminded me of the way that our committee used to function, and it was wonderful. It was a good experience, and I think we can all learn and profit from it. We did the people's work. Now we have a number of good bipartisan taxpayer service bills. Many of these provisions are from House and Senate Democratic bills. In fact, this is the first time in many years that we had a bipartisan taxpayer service bill ready for tax day. It is in a very, very long time. I would like to thank my colleagues for working with me to protect low-income taxpayers from private debt collection companies under contract with IRS. The National Taxpayer Advocate recently found that the private debt collection costs 3 times more than it collects, and that low-income taxpayers are making payment they cannot afford. This must end. As you can see, we worked hard on these bills, and we put people before politics. We literally put the taxpayer first. I'm proud of our process and product. Again, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member, I look forward to your questions.
John, thank you very much. Ms. Cheney? Nope, she's not there. Well, she used to be. Mr. Chairman, there's a lot of talk about the scope and nature of everything the IRS does, and they only put so much money into taking questions from taxpayers. They're held online. They don't get the right answer. Many times they're not held accountable and responsible for the advice they give. There's been a long discussion for a long time about making the tax code easier to also administer. Was that part of what has been done with the last tax bill? and presumptively what we're trying to do here is accommodate a better relationship where the IRS can more carefully do their job, or are you just putting something on them that makes sense for us but might not for them?
So the answer is no. We work very closely with the Treasury and the IRS on this bill. I really defer to Chairman Jenkins and Ranking Member Lewis, but, you know, what we're attempting to do here is to redesign, refocus, and rein in the IRS. Redesign them into a taxpayer-first agency with that singular mission, requiring them to bring back to Congress a restructuring along these lines, refocusing them on the customer service we all want for our constituents. This isn't a partisan issue at all. We know there can be a much stronger a focus on that, and this bill gives them tools and requirements to meet that. And then reining in the abuses, Mr. Lewis, for example, has joined with Mr. Roscom on making sure the IRS doesn't improperly seize assets and dispose of them really against the taxpayer's will and against the will of Congress and the law, all of which we think makes for a better IRS. I'm really want to yield, though, to Chairman Jenkins and Mr. Lewis for this.
Well, as the name suggests, Mr. Chairman, the singular mission of this legislation was to put the taxpayer first. And the redesign puts an emphasis on customer service by requiring the IRS to submit to Congress plans to restructure the agency to improve that efficiency and enhance the system for all taxpayers. We're going to guarantee that the IRS is living up to its quality service mission. It encourages the use of some common sense customer service features like a callback option, which doesn't exist today. It's just nice to have taxpayers be the focus of a piece of legislation.
And part of our effort is to bring the IRS into the 21st century. It's still operating in the horse and buggy age. It's important. And be kind and be good to the American people.
Well, they have a new administrator. I did not take part in those discussions with the new administrator. I still have not heard you say, and the IRS is going to welcome these new opportunities that we're giving them. So that's probably the question that I should have asked up front, as opposed to, is this designed to help them become more efficient? The question is, how well are they going to accept this? Because they are a culture unto themselves, and I don't, I'm not going to sit here, I'm not trying to do anything other than I want to see the sides, the opportunity that we see in the Article 1 for Article 2 to say, we think we ought to get there too. So is this welcome in their culture?
Well, let me just say this. The subcommittee worked very closely with the IRS to make sure that these provisions are workable and achievable. But I want to be very clear, Congress's intent here is to refocus that agency on taxpayer first, not enforcement, first, taxpayer first service. And so, and at the end of the day, that is who comes first. Congress is making that very clear.
I just might add,
Yeah,
Mr.
please.
Chairman,
Yes, sir.
we just imposed something out of a hat. We met with the officials for the IRS, the rank and file employees in several meetings.
And they're open to this.
Yes.
They are indeed. Our staff work closely with theirs. I know I met with the acting commissioner, and he's eager to see improvements within the agency, and I'm sure will provide the leadership necessary, as will the incoming administrator. And they certainly provided a lot of technical assistance during the drafting of the legislation, so we're hopeful that they will be partners in this.
I think it's vitally important that we approach them together and that we do it in a bipartisan basis, because I can think of nothing worse than we continue to take billions of dollars from them at the time they need to modernize. So we've got to find a balancing act there. Mr. Chairman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not going to take a lot of time because we have members of this stature, and frankly, both parties coming together with a product like this. I don't have any doubts it's a good one, but I am going to take, these are three of my favorite members for three very different reasons, so I want to tick them off real fast. I don't know if you remember this, the gentleman from Georgia, but when I first got here, I was on the 5th floor of Cannon. And for those of us who don't know where that is, that means you had a really bad room draw. You're a freshman, not many people that want to see you anyway, and the ones that do can't find you because you're on the 5th floor of Cannon. Even the elevators don't all go up to the 5th floor. So much to my surprise, I'd been there about 2 months, and my staff assistant at the desk came back and said, Congressman Lewis from Georgia is here to see you. Well, why in the world? And it turned out I was in the same office that you'd been in when you were a freshman, and you were kind enough to come up to not even know who was there, but just to welcome them here and tell them it was going to get better. And I've never, ever forgotten your graciousness, and I appreciate it very much. Then I had the honor of being the chairman of our campaign committee in 2008. It was a pretty brutal year. My star candidate, Mr. Lewis, sitting right next to you because she won in a year when nobody should have or could have, and actually reclaimed the seat for us that we had lost. And I've been so proud of her to watch her. The only time she ever got me mad is when she announced she's retiring. Which you guys need to gang up on her on Ways and Means and reclaim her. And finally, my good friend, the chairman, who makes me happy every day. We're the only guys in history that our chairman here twice asked to run the dues committee at the NRCC. Nothing like going and asking your colleagues to give up money once, then to come back the next year. I never could figure out whether we did it that well or he was just really mad at both of us for some reason. But it's a pleasure to have all three of you here, and it's a real pleasure. I want to associate myself with Mr. Govern's remarks. It is good to see the committee working together, working in a bipartisan fashion and on something that's obviously going to be the benefit of the average taxpayer and the American people. And so you're to be commended for your work and look forward to supporting it on the floor. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I want to thank all three of you for being here, and Mr. Lewis, thank you for your kind words about our colleague Louise Slaughter. She had great admiration for you, and we miss her, and I appreciate your welcome and your friendship, and I'm proud to serve in this Congress with you. And Ms. Jenkins, I agree with Mr. Cole. I'm sorry you're leaving. I hope we can pick up your seat, but I'm sorry you're leaving. Because we serve as co-chairs of the House Hunger Caucus, and I appreciate the gentlelady's commitment to trying to end hunger and food insecurity in this country, and it's been a joy to work with you. And Mr. Brady, thank you very much for bringing to this committee three bills that do reflect a bipartisan process. And like I said, I don't want to spoil this moment by talking too long, because I think this is the way this should be done, and everybody's happy with the process, and so I have nothing to complain about. So with that, I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too want to thank our witnesses for being here today and bringing these bills. I will just say, as far as the customer service aspect of the Taxpayer First Act, I have a local tax attorney back home, Bob Widmer is his name, and he started with the folks at the United Way, a low-income tax clinic, in August of 2016. And I must admit, I question his sanity for doing it. We have a University of North Texas in Denton, Texas. They do have a law school, but that's down in Dallas. But he didn't do this in conjunction with the law students. He did it in conjunction with the CPA students, and found that with working with CPA students and with a small caseload, identifying people who are having troubled needs that weren't being met by the IRS, my district office, trying to help with the taxpayer advocacy service, as many of you know, it was practically immobile. You just could not. It was so it just wasn't facile enough to deal with people's problems. And so this clinic he set up actually does. And I think what you're doing today is very much taking the organizational structure that features operating units serving particular groups of taxpayers with similar needs. That's exactly on point. So low-income individuals, many who do not speak English, who were just going to run afoul of our taxing system, but they just needed a small amount of help, and now they are getting that help. And I'll tell you something that he found in doing this. He's an Air Force veteran himself, graduate of the Air Force Academy. He found that veterans' needs were really significant and unmet in this space. And as a consequence, he has opened up a second clinic for veterans taxpayer assistance, which has become enormously popular. So I appreciate what you've done with this. I think it's exactly what was needed, and perhaps other groups in other areas of the country will now find it a little bit more straightforward in trying to help their constituents who need these services. But thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the recognition. I don't have specific questions. I'm just glad you're here today and glad you're doing what you're doing. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to take a moment of personal privilege and introduce Herlene Mathew, who is an intern in my office. She and another intern, Katrina Martell, prepared me for this particular hearing, along with my regular Rules Committee staff person, and I'm deeply appreciative. I'm going to read the remarks that they prepared. I don't have questions for our witnesses. I'm grateful to all of them, and like all of you, I'm deeply respectful of the extraordinary work that they do. Mr. Lewis, I watched television, and I saw you throw a strike. Yeah, he threw out the first pitch for the Washington Nationals, and the way they've been playing, they need you to throw every day. The only team I noticed worse is the Marlins, and maybe you could come down that way as well. But in any event, Mr. Chairman, I'll have an awful lot to say tomorrow with reference to the measure. So let me read what Herlene and Katrina wrote. It is commendable that this bipartisan bill would protect children, immigrants, and other individuals with limited credit history from synthetic identity fraud. While I applaud this bipartisan effort, I must ask what we are doing to protect the young people caught in legal limbo as a result of the blocked DREAM Act. The bipartisan support that H.R. 5192 has garnered demonstrates the ability of Congress to come together as a collective to not only acknowledge the issue of identity theft, but to take the necessary actions to combat this issue. Yet, why do we continue to ignore and undermine the more pressing and menacing phenomenon of gun violence, which threatens lives every day? And to add to that, Mr. Chairman, last week in this room, we entertained members who were presenting the Balanced Budget Act, and clearly this matter and that one could have been on the suspension calendar. And I question when such pressing issues are still confronting us, the gun violence issues that are raised and continue to be raised by young people and others in this country is one of significance that we seem to not want to address. We're not doing anything about the infrastructure. This is supposed to be Infrastructure Week, along with Tax Week, I thought, and evidently we aren't going to address that as well. And not to mention immigration reform, countless measures that all of us know are in need of being addressed. And yet we are here discussing a matter, or two or three matters, that could very well have been on the suspension calendar. So I thank Herlene and Katrina for their profound commentary, and I would urge that they continue their attitude along with millennials and young people. And doubtless one day this institution will do as this committee has done with reference to these matters, and that's work through regular order and allow for good legislation to be done in a proper manner. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Georgia does not seek time. Gentleman from Colorado.
I just want to thank the gentleman from Georgia, gentleman from Texas. Thank you so much for working together and bringing some bills that we can get done.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, on today, April 16th, and tomorrow's tax day this year, almost every single American's thinking about the Internal Revenue Service, so this is perfect timing to bring these bills up, and I applaud you for the hard work in getting that done by today so that they can be considered by Congress. And I would just admonish all of us to, when April 18th comes around, that we continue to work on how we can improve the service that's provided by that very important agency. You know, the IRS is the agency people love to hate, but it's an absolutely necessary one, and the function that they provide is very important for this country. But there are improvements that can be made, and these are great steps in reform, great steps in protecting taxpayers from fraud and identity theft, and I applaud your work for doing that. There's nothing I can imagine worse than filing your taxes and finding out that somebody else has already done it for you using your number. So that would, or being a child and growing up to where you actually use your Social Security number and find out that it's been improperly used prior to your applications. So I applaud your efforts to improve the system, to make it more customer friendly, and make it more usable, and maybe we can start to take down that feeling that a lot of Americans have to talk about the agency everyone loves to hate, and make it truly something that, not that we're going to look forward to sending in our taxes every year, but certainly an agency that we can work with to find the right answer that's fair, and people will appreciate that. So I will have more time to visit with about this on the floor as we move forward in the process, but I just want to say I appreciate very much your hard work for getting this before us today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to thank the members of the Ways and Means Committee for this outstanding work. And Mr. Brady, I had a question for you. I was going to ask you on the floor, but since we're on the record, I thought let's just ask it now. I was in the beautiful town of Boulder, Colorado this weekend. There were some smells, sort of burning leaf kind of smells, but for the most part, it was just a beautiful time. But someone asked me a question. I said to them, I will take this back to Chairman Brady, and I will ask him personally. They wanted to know, since we are coming up on tax day, whether Americans are under-taxed or overspending in this country. And the reason they asked the question was all they hear about the tax bill that was recently passed is that it's going to cause a deficit. If we are under-taxed, then obviously we have to raise taxes. If we are overspending, obviously we have to reduce our spending. But I wondered if you had an answer to that question.
Well, I believe Washington takes too much of what our Main Street businesses and our families earn. That's why the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was really about giving people back more of what they earn, whether you're a single mom who's fighting for the future of her daughter and working late hours. It's that mom and pop store that's risking everything and working nights and weekends, and questions who has claims over that, all that hard work. We think it's the American public, the people who earn it. And so the Congressional Budget Office pointed out we have more federal revenue by $1 trillion over the next decade after tax reform than before tax reform. So I think we spend too much, and I think we're going to have to find in a bipartisan way ways that we can be more efficient.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from Wyoming does not seek time. I will just disagree with my friend from Washington in a mild degree. This is a pretty good week to bring up these bills. This would have been a great week to bring up the fair tax, if that's what you were, were thinking. I have to say to my friend from
Let's not spoil the moment.
Mr. McGovern, you will recognize the wisdom of this. You know, we all have things we want to do. I sit up here and listen to you from time to time time to time, talk about things that are important to you, that you believe in, that you're not going to rest until you get them done. The fair tax falls into that category for me, but I look at what my friend from Kansas has done here. She has been a leader on the fair tax to say, hey, you can't give an agency the kind of power that you give the IRS and expect it to operate in a flawless manner. With that kind of great power comes abuse almost inherently. But even though we can't do away with the IRS today, my friend from Kansas said, what can I do to make a difference and move the needle? And joined with my good friend from Georgia, who I know hears about the fair tax back home on a regular basis, to say, let's make a difference. The independent the independent hearing process in particular means a lot to me. I remember, Mr. Chairman, when we were first talking about tax reform, we talked about what maybe even an extrajudicial opportunity for taxpayers who aren't trained tax attorneys, who don't have the big money of Wall Street firms, but who want a fair shake because they did everything they thought they could do to play by the rules, but the rules are so daggum complicated that folks can't. That's why I want to strip the rules out and start over. But it's encouraging to me that even when folks can't do it all, we still commit ourselves to do a little, and in a bipartisan way, as has been done here. I just want you to know, Mr. Chairman, that there's still time. I've heard talks about tax reform Part 2 percolating around here and there, and if I could just put one thing on the bipartisan plate, one of the things the fair tax deals with that nobody else does is the payroll tax. Of course, it's the largest tax that 85% of American families pay. And if we really want to talk about families and dealing with paychecks in a way that hits them each and every pay period, we've got to have that payroll tax conversation. We have to have it sooner rather than later because Social Security and Medicare aren't going to be able to meet their obligations under the current tax system. But also it will make a difference for folks back home. So thank you, Ms. Jenkins, for making this start. I hope in the next 9 months that you have to be with us, you can solve our payroll tax challenges too. And to Mr. Lewis, Mr. Brady, you can appreciate this because now that your face has been plastered all over national television during the tax reform debate, you probably can't get through the airport without folks wanting to come and talk to you, tell you thank you for making a difference in their family's life. But I don't fly to Texas, I fly to Georgia. So I get to see Mr. Lewis day in and day out. I see him try to make it down the front steps of the Capitol with school children running up from all directions to say, Mr. Lewis, can we get a moment of your time? And he always gives it to them. I get to see him at the Delta Terminal at Reagan with school children running from absolutely every direction saying, Mr. Lewis, can we just say hello to you? And he always gives them time. And I get to see him when we get off the plane at the other end, where school children run from every direction saying, Mr. Lewis, can I say hello? Can I just speak a word? And he always gives them time. We don't have enough folks that have earned our respect and garnered our unfailing loyalty. Mr. Lewis will be representing the 5th District of Georgia for as long as Mr. Lewis chooses to represent the 5th District of Georgia. But even after all these years, he treats those school children as he's the very first elected office he's ever held on the very first day he's ever had it, trying to inspire those young people to believe that this system of self-governance we have, as imperfect as it is the best that the world has to offer. And if we commit ourselves to it, we can make it better. So just thank you for that. We all know how tough it is going through our day-to-day lives, trying to get to votes and make things happen. We don't have any other members of Congress here who are as aggressively pursued as Mr. Lewis is for all the right reasons by all those young people that we all hope to inspire. So thank you for continuing to do that. Ms. Torres, this will be my first chance to recognize you. Do you have any questions for the most distinguished panel you've ever seen at the Rules Committee? All right. Gentle lady yields back. Well, with that, this concludes this panel. Thank you all very much for being here. And we'll move to panel number 2, which, if my eyes do not deceive me, includes Mr. Sherman, And anyone else who seeks
I have some amendments
to give testimony? My friend, Mr. Polis, would like to give testimony, and we'll be going to the table to do that.
And Mr. Chairman, if I just want to formally recognize our new colleague, Norma Torres. We're very delighted to have her join our ranks on the Rules Committee, and she's going to be an outstanding member, and we're going to be very proud of her, and you're going to enjoy debating her.
Ms. Torres, I have no doubt that the first 6 things he said were true. That last one may or may not be true, but I'm glad to have you here. Welcome to our small 13-member family here. As you gentlemen know, anything you have in writing will be submitted. You can submit it. We will have it made a part of the record, and the committee welcomes your oral statements. Chair would recognize Mr. Sherman.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be on the second finest panel that my colleague from California has ever seen in this committee. There's some discussion about the 3 bills perhaps being suspension bills, and people will wonder, why do we have to vote on a rule? And I have a solution for you, and that is to make in order what I believe is the only amendment being presented. I'm an old CPA. I went on to head the 2nd largest tax agency in the country, and I am very interested in simplifying this process for taxpayers. And the Taxpayer First Act is an excellent bill that does that. It would be even more excellent if we eliminated one provision, namely Section 202. That provision has the effect of locking in permanently the free file program. And if we don't have that provision, then the free file program will continue through 2020 and as far into the future as the IRS wants it to. So by not having Section 202 in the bill, you leave it to the IRS to determine how long to keep this program going. Now, free file program sounds so good, you might wonder why we wouldn't want to compel the IRS to keep it forever. What the program promises to do is to say that you've got free access to software as long as you make less than $66,000 a year. But in reality, if you go to TurboTax, you're only allowed to get the free filing if you make under $33,000. If you go to H&R Block, you get the free software only if you're under age 50. I personally take offense at that. But the free file program, even if it were completely free of any cost for using the software, isn't free because it's tremendous time and effort before you sit down to the computer to use it. You've got to gather your 1099 INT, 1099 DIV, 1099G, 1099R, your 1098, your W-2. If you're missing any one of those documents, you have an April 15th, go find the document crisis. Even if you have all those documents, you have to understand them well enough to know which one goes into the software where. So you have a system now that even if it was totally free, is not free of a lot of work and not free of a lot of error. Now, I think it should continue to, or might well continue to 2020. It could continue after that. But there is a better system. And what I don't like about the so-called free filer program is that it prohibits the IRS from pursuing this other better system. The better system is a pre-prepared return. This is being used in Norway, Finland, Denmark, Sweden, Spain, Belgium, Japan, Chile, and the United Kingdom. How would it work? The IRS fills out your form. They already have your 1099s and your 1098s and your W-2s. They send you that pre-prepared form. You can hit submit, or you can make changes and then submit, or you can throw away the IRS's draft, go use TurboTax or H&R Block and submit your own return the old-fashioned way. This is not a new idea. In 1998, a Republican Congress mandated that the IRS develop a return-free tax filing system, established a deadline for 2008. Unfortunately, that was never done. So we should not force the IRS to enter into agreements that contain these non-compete clauses that have the effect of preventing the IRS from being as helpful to taxpayers as modern technology allows them to be. Instead, you should make in order my amendment, which would strike Section 202, allow the IRS to stick with the current program through 2020, and then explore whether they want the free filer program, the pre-prepared system, or both. And I look forward to the day when most of my constituents just get the IRS to do the work for them, hit submit, maybe add a change or two, and are done. And I look forward to not hearing from people who are yelling, where am I going to, oh, I can't find my W-2 form. What is this 1099-G and what do I do with it? There is a better system. A lot of other countries are using it. We shouldn't prohibit it. And this bill would be better if we allowed the House floor to strike this one section. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have 3 amendments. It is rare, as you know, that Ways and Means sends a bill to this committee. It's only happened a handful of times in the last few years. Obviously, most notably, the Tax Reform Act, where I did also attempt to add these amendments. They unfortunately weren't added to that act. I'm hopeful that they will be added with the necessary waivers to these Ways and Means bills. The first one is the Kombucha Act, which is a bicameral bill. The committee is familiar with kombucha, and yet kombucha manufacturers are still hit with a significant tax disadvantage. And I hope that the Republican majority takes the opportunity to do something that is business friendly and provides some meaningful tax relief to an important sector, the kombucha sector, given that the alcohol by volume content of kombucha is less than 0.5%. It makes no sense to regulate this tea product like we regulate or tax alcohol. And by taking kombucha out from under the alcohol tax and the regulatory code, we can really put this industry on level footing with soda, pop, and other beverages. This straightforward amendment is a bipartisan, bicameral bill. It's exactly the kind of reforms our small businesses care about. It's very simple. I hope that this committee will attach to this Ways and Means bill. I also have another bipartisan amendment with, based on a bill, bipartisan bill with my colleague, Mr. Schweikert, the Cryptocurrency Tax Fairness Act. This would simply make a $600 de minimis threshold for any reporting requirements with cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. Currently, a major impediment to the use of cryptocurrencies is the potential for tax liability for de minimis transactions. We already do this with other forms of foreign currency, and this is very consistent with how we treat other currencies. When somebody buys a cup of coffee with Bitcoin, they shouldn't have to do a filing with the IRS. It probably costs more than a cup of coffee to do that paperwork. So I hope that this committee will adopt that one as well. The next one is a very important pro-business tax reform for the cannabis industry, very important in my state of Colorado. This would revise Section 280E of the tax code to exempt marijuana sales. This is the aspect of the tax code that prevents our legal cannabis businesses, both in the medicinal and the recreational side, from deducting their ordinary business expenses. In effect, without this amendment that we can include here today, legal businesses in my state are forced to pay an effective federal tax rate as high as 70%. I thought Republicans didn't like 70% tax rates, but you can show that by adopting this amendment. If you fail to adopt this amendment, you're showing that taxing small businesses is just another thing the Republican Party wants to do while they increasingly bloat the deficit. By revising Section 280 of the tax code, we can protect small businesses, not just in Colorado, Mr. Chairman, but in over 24 states that have either medicinal or recreational marijuana. Our businesses need to be given this opportunity to succeed. They need to be taxed like other small businesses, period. And that's what my amendment will do. I'm confident we have the votes on the floor to pass this. I think it will pass overwhelmingly. All 3 will pass overwhelmingly. And I encourage the committee to grant the necessary waivers to include these 3 amendments, and I'd be happy to yield for any questions.
Gentleman yields back. I want to thank the gentleman from California for couldn't have said it better. In fact, I may clip it and start sending it out to folks back home about, even though the tax code is as simple as it has ever been, we've been trying to exempt as many people as possible from some of the difficult schedules that go along with that. It is still a complicated undertaking for millions of Americans across this land. I have one proposal for solving that, but your observation that locking in solutions for simplicity sometimes don't get that done. I'm grateful to you for pointing that out. To Mr. Polis's point about kombucha not being an alcoholic beverage, it is for sale downstairs in the Capitol carryout for $4.95 a bottle. There is no wine cooler available. There is no Pabst Blue Ribbon available, but there is kombucha available, which seems to make your point that this is not the alcoholic beverage. There's no alcoholic beverage license in the bottom of the Capitol to dispense that beverage. While it is rare that a Ways and Means bill comes to the Rules Committee, it is even rarer that amendments are made in order to a Ways and Means bill that comes to committee. But I would certainly support moving your kombucha bill out of committee, and I look forward to seeing it here in the Rules Committee at a later date. Gentleman from Oklahoma. No question. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Well, I support the amendments, and I think Mr. Sherman's amendment is certainly germane to these bills, and I'm glad that you support, I think we're getting to the point where we're getting used to hearing good ideas like the ones Mr. Polis has brought to the committee, and everybody saying, well, we can't make them in order, but that you look forward to working with him to someday make them in order. I hope I live long enough to see that day where they're made in order. But, these bills, as we mentioned before, were the result of a truly bipartisan process, and I'd like to think that we can continue that bipartisanship in the Rules Committee. So, but I thank the gentleman for testifying, and I yield back.
I would say to my friend, I take his point. We also hear here in the Rules Committee that it's offensive to the membership to bring things to the floor without a hearing, and we hear from members here on the committee that it's offensive to the membership to bring things to the committee for the very first time, having not had any oversight in committee, and we hear from the membership that having closed rules are troubling. I recognize the gentleman's concerns.
But the last time I checked, amendments don't need hearings. People aren't complaining about not having hearings on certain amendments. I mean, that's the whole point of the Rules Committee, is that some people who are not on the committee, have ideas they want to offer, and so we bring them to the Rules Committee, we make them in order. So I don't really understand the gentleman's point. I just regret the fact that a lot of good ideas routinely get blocked up here, and I think not just Democratic ideas, by the way, a lot of Republican ideas get blocked, and we need to move beyond that. And maybe we could take some inspiration for the bipartisan way the Ways and Means Committee worked on these bills, and maybe some of that will rub off on some of us up here.
That and Ms. Torres's presence, that combination of those two things may lead us to different sets of results going forward.
The gentleman yield for just a moment. Did Mr. McGovern just say that there were some good Republican ideas?
Well, maybe I misspoke. No,
that was an off the record.
No, I think there are. There are good.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yeah, I'm happy to yield.
All the ideas I presented are bipartisan ideas, and in fact,
so there are good Republican
one of them
ideas.
is a Republican lead on the bill, Mr. Schweikert.
See, I mean, I've been so good at this hearing today. I've been so praiseworthy of the process, and just want to continue that. So,
Gentleman from Washington.
Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I just want to recognize the new leaf Mr. McGovern has turned over is a welcome thing. We can keep it going on a regular basis. That'd be great. I don't have any questions for the panelists. I appreciate the ideas they brought to the committee. They're very interesting. What I did want to recognize is finally the Democrats have brought someone to the committee with a level of civility and intelligence that speaks well for the Democratic Party, and someone from my class and served first in the 114th Congress. So, Ms. Torres from California, welcome very much to the Rules Committee. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We look forward to working with the young lady from California.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Chairman, I certainly am glad that Ms. Torres is here, and I don't have any questions of our witnesses. I support making both their presentations and their amendments in order, and I would only say to my good friend, from Washington, that I thought that I was always civil toward you, but you can expect incivility from now on. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Would the gentleman yield?
Of course, I'll yield.
I was just indicating a higher level of civility, not saying we were at
It gets worse, man. You ought to stop right where you are.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Colorado.
Mr. Chairman, I also want to welcome the young lady from California. We share a common love for the country of Guatemala and have on many occasions shared stories about that. And I welcome her to the committee and look forward to working with her. And I'm sure that our debates on the floor will be much more civil than the debates with other members of this committee. I yield back.
Does the gentleman from Colorado have any questions for the gentleman from California?
The gentleman for offering the amendment. I would support allowing that, and I want to welcome the gentlelady from California to the committee as well. We're excited to have you here.
The gentlelady from Wyoming.
I would like to welcome the gentlelady from California, and I'm just so befuddled by the happiness and the joy that's breaking out. I'm speechless, Mr. Chairman, so I yield back. And thank you to our witnesses as well, and I yield back.
The last word then will go to the gentlelady from California.
Thank you so much. I look forward to working with all of you, and I hope that we can move forward these amendments. I fully support them 100%. Yes, I have turned the leaf of marijuana. Not 100%, but I have. Personally, I'm still very old-fashioned, but I understand that many of our states are moving forward and are trying to find a way to stop the ongoing problem of dealing with cash, because that creates so many more problems for our community. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman, thank you very much. Anything you have in writing, if you will please leave, we will make sure that is a part of the record. Does any other member wish to be heard? Seeing none, this closes the hearing portion. The chair will be in receipt of a motion from the gentleman from Oklahoma.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H.R. 5192, the Protecting Children from Identity Theft Act, a closed rule. Rule provides 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Ways and Means. Rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. Rule provides that an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee print 115-68 shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. Finally, the rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions.
The committee has heard the motion from the gentleman from Oklahoma. Is there any amendment or discussion? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Oklahoma. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. The chair will be in receipt of a second motion, the gentleman from Oklahoma.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H.R. 5444, the Taxpayer First Act, and H.R. 5445, the 21st Century IRS Act, each a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of debate on each bill, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Ways and Means. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of each bill. The rule provides that the respective amendments in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Ways and Means, now printed in each bill, shall be considered as adopted, and each bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in each bill as amended. The rule provides each bill one motion to recommit with or without instructions. Section 3 of the rule directs that the clerk to, in the engrossment of H.R. 5444, add the text of H.R. 2901, H.R. 5437, H.R. 5438, H.R. 5439, H.R. 5440, H.R. 5443, H.R. 5445, and H.R. 5446 as passed by the House as a new matter at the end of H.R. 5444 and make technical and conforming modifications in the engrossment. Finally, the rule provides that upon the addition of H.R. 2901, H.R. 5437, H.R. 5438, H.R. 5439, H.R. 5440, H.R. 5443, H.R. 5445, and H.R. 5446, as passed by the House, to the engrossment of H.R. 5444, H.R. 2901, H.R. 5437, H.R. 5438, H.R. 5439, H.R. 5440, H.R. 5443, H.R. 5445, and H.R. 5446 shall be laid on the table.
Committee has heard the motion from the gentleman from Oklahoma. Is there any amendment or discussion? Gentleman from Colorado.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make an order and give the necessary waivers for the following amendments to H.R. 5444. My amendment number 2, which allows small businesses located in states that have legalized marijuana to utilize tax deductions. My amendment number 3, which inserts the text of H.R. 1089, the Kombucha Act. My amendment number 4, which inserts the text of H.R. 3708, the Cryptocurrency Tax Fairness Act. If I may, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I think that I made the case as to the merits of these bills. I think that both would have, all three would have a bipartisan majority to pass. They are bipartisan bills, which my colleague, Mr. Buck, called for. And also, we need to do more amendments this week. I mean, we're here, and there's just these two bills, and if we don't have any amendments out, what are we going to be doing on the floor? So, I mean, I want to have plenty of time to debate these bills, and it's a question of when. Every time I come, it's a good idea, but we have to do this, we have to do that. Well, this is a good week because we have plenty of time to do these amendments. I mean, you know, we could take 20, 30 minutes each, hour and a half, we could get these three done. And I think that would be the will of the body, and then we'll get them over to the Senate. And I hope that we can adopt them.
Is there any other discussion on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado? Hearing none, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed will say no. No. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The gentleman from Colorado requests a roll call. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Cole?
No.
Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Sessions?
No.
Mr. Sessions? No. Mr. Burgess? No. Mr. Burgess? No. Mr. Collins? No. Mr. Collins? No. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Newhouse? No. Mr. Newhouse? No. Mr. Buck? Ms. Cheney? No. Ms. Cheney? No. Mr. McGovern?
Aye.
Mr. McGovern? Aye. Mr. Hastings? Aye. Mr. Hastings? Aye. Mr. Polis? Aye. Mr. Polis? Aye. Ms. Torres? Ms. Torres? Aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman? No.
Clerk will report the total.
4 yeas, 7 nays.
4 yeas, 7 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. Is there any further amendment or discussion? Hearing none, the question is on the motion offered by the gentleman from Oklahoma. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed will say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, for the majority, Mr. Newhouse will be handling the first and second rules, and for the minority?
So on H.R. 5192, Mr. Hastings will handle it for the minority, and on H.R. 5444 and H.R. 5445, Mr. Polis will handle it.
I'm informed that no additional meetings are scheduled for the Rules Committee this week. This concludes the meeting.